The mountains have always carried a strange silence, not the peaceful kind that makes you rest easy, but the kind that presses on your chest and whispers that something is waiting, hidden in the shadows of stone and pine. On nights when the wind cuts sharp through the trees, the silence breaks with voices, some swearing it is just the cry of a bird, others saying it is the echo of lost souls. But for one man the sound was different. It was not a myth, not a ghostly tale. It was a child's voice, trembling and desperate. Wallow said. You'd save me, she'd save me, she cried, her words rattling through the still air. They weren't carried by imagination, nor by the howling wind. They were real, raw, a cry that could not be ignored. The man who heard her was not a stranger to loneliness. He had lived in the mountain cabin for more years than most cared to count. He was known by few, spoken of by many, and understood by none. People in the nearest village called him the Mountain Man, a figure who kept to himself, half legend, half truth. They said he had left the world behind after it took too much from him, his family, his peace, maybe even his faith. He did not argue with what people believed. Silence suited him better than explanations. But on that night, as the voice of the girl broke through the dark, the silence he had clung to all those years began to crack. He stumbled from his porch into the wild cold, ears straining to follow the sound. The moon hung heavy above, pale light spilling across the jagged rocks and frozen ground. He moved quickly, not thinking, only listening. The voice grew closer, weaker, yet more urgent with each step he took. His boots sank into the earth, the scent of pine sharp in his lungs, his heart thundering like the storms that rolled off the peaks. And then he saw her, a girl, no older than 10, stood trembling against the base of a dead tree. Her wrists were bound by heavy chains that gleamed under the moonlight, biting into her skin with every movement. Her dress was torn, her hair wild with dirt and wind, but her eyes wide, frightened, shining with tears locked onto his. She looked at him as though she had been waiting, so she already knew who he was. Mama said you'd save me, she repeated, her voice breaking into sobs. The man froze. For years he had avoided the world, convinced he was too broken to mend anything, let alone another life. Yet here she stood, calling him savior when he had not even saved himself. His throat tightened, and a wave of emotions he had buried beneath years of silence crashed over him. He stepped closer, hands trembling as if the air itself carried weight. He reached out, not for the chains at first, but for her shoulder, to let her know she was not alone. Her small body shuddered beneath his touch, fragile but filled with a strength that only suffering could carve into a soul. The chains rattled as she tried to move toward him, their clanging echoing across the forest like a cruel reminder. He wanted to tear them apart with his bare hands, to lift her into his arms and carry her far away from the pain that had marked her. But the chains were thick, the locks cruelly forged. They weren't made to break easily. His eyes burned, not just from the cold, but from the tears he had not shed in years. For a long time, he had told himself that tears served no purpose, that the world only hardened with every drop spilled. But standing there, looking at her bruised wrists and desperate gaze, the dam inside him broke. His tears fell freely, streaking through the dirt on his face, carrying with them a grief and tenderness long denied. The girl lifted her head, hope flickering in her eyes as though his tears alone meant her suffering was near an end. The mountain man wept openly, his chest heaving, his arms finally opening wide. He did not think about who had put her there, or why fate had dragged him into this moment. All he knew was that the girl's cry had pierced the silence of his exile, and he could not turn away. The wind grew colder, curling around them, as though the forest itself watched in stillness. Somewhere beyond the trees a branch cracked, not from his steps, not from hers. Someone else was out there, watching, waiting. The chains on the girl were not just random cruelty. They belonged to someone, and that someone was not far. The mountain man's eyes darted to the shadows, every instinct honed by years of survival screaming at him that this was no accident. His tears still fell, but now his jaw tightened. His heart pulled in two directions, one filled with fear, the other with resolve. He had lived hidden for so long, escaping pain by burying himself in solitude. But solitude had ended tonight. The girl's trembling lips whispered again. Almost too faint to hear, "Don't leave me," and he knew he couldn't. The forest seemed to close in tighter, silence stretching like a blade across the night. He wiped his tears with the back of his hand, his other tightening into a fist. Somewhere in those shadows lay the answers: who had chained her, why she had been abandoned, and why her voice had called out to him above all others. But as he bent low, pressing his hands to the cold iron, he felt it. The chains were not just metal. They carried something heavier, something that seemed to resist his strength, as though alive. The locks hissed when touched, cold, searing his skin. This was no ordinary cruelty. The mountain man looked into the girl's eyes one last time, and his voice cracked with the weight of it all. "I'll save you." The words left his lips not as a promise to her alone, but as a vow to himself, to the broken man he had been, to the silence he had endured. His arms pulled her close, tears falling into her hair as the chains rattled louder, and then, from deep within the forest, a low voice answered back, "You won't." The night seemed to shudder, and the mountain man froze. He turned slowly toward the sound, every muscle coiled, every tear now burning with fire. The girl clung to him tighter, her chains heavy against his chest. The silence of the mountains was broken for good, and nothing would ever be the same. The forest went still after that voice, as if every creature that lived among the roots and branches had stopped breathing. The mountain man's heart hammered in his chest, his arms tightening around the girl as if someone might pull her from him at any moment. He turned slowly, his eyes sweeping across the black curtain of trees. There was no figure stepping into the light, no enemy revealing themselves. Only the echo of those words. "You won't," curling through the silence like smoke. The girl buried her face against his coat, her small body trembling. He could feel her tears soaking into the worn fabric, could hear the uneven rhythm of her breaths. For a moment, he closed his eyes, steadying himself. The mountain had been his home for years, and he knew its sounds better than anyone. But this was something else. This was not the voice of a beast, nor the tricks of wind in the pines. This was human, deliberate, and near. He crouched lower, pulling the girl close so she would feel hidden in his shadow. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. She nodded, though the chains rattled softly as she shifted, and that sound seemed to carry too far in the night. He gritted his teeth. Whoever had bound her had wanted her suffering to be heard. His mind pulled back through the years, back to when he had still lived among people. He had once worked with iron, with wood, with things men built with their hands. He knew the weight of a chain, the strength of a lock. What bound the girl wasn't meant for ordinary cruelty. It was crafted for something darker. He could feel it when he touched the cold metal. It wasn't just restraint. It was possession. And the voice in the woods, the one that taunted him now, belonged to whoever claimed that possession. The man glanced at the moon. It was high, washing silver light across the clearing, but the shadows around the tree were darker than they should have been. He had always trusted the mountain to reveal truth in its silence, but tonight the silence seemed to conspire against him. He could not see who was watching, yet he knew he was not alone. The girl pulled back slightly, her voice trembling. "Mama said you'd come. She told me not to be afraid if it hurt, not to let the dark take me." Her words were broken by sobs, but there was something steady underneath them, as though she had been repeating those lines over and over to keep herself alive. His chest ached as he listened. Who was her mother? Why had she spoken of him as if she knew him, when he had not spoken to another soul in years? He wanted to ask, but the questions would have to wait. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on him. Whoever had spoken was still out there. He needed to move, to get her away from the clearing before the night closed in tighter. He tugged gently at the chains again, but the locks hissed cold against his skin, searing him like frostbite. He pulled back with a grunt. Ordinary strength wouldn't free her. He would need tools, fire, maybe more. That meant the cabin. His cabin was not far. A crooked little shelter built against stone and earth, hidden from the paths most men traveled. It would be safer there for a time. "We're leaving," he whispered, lifting her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her body thin as if she hadn't eaten in days. The chains dragged heavily, clinking against the ground as he straightened. He hated the sound. It was too loud, too sharp in the stillness, but he had no choice. He held her close, pressing forward into the trees. The forest path twisted in darkness, branches scraping at his shoulders, the earth uneven beneath his boots. He moved quickly but carefully, every sense straining. The girl clung to him without a word, her head pressed against his chest. But her chains trailed behind like a cruel reminder. Every step made them rattle, and every rattle seemed to stir the silence deeper as he walked. His mind pulled back into memories he had tried for years to bury. He had once carried another child in his arms, long ago, through nights just as cold. His daughter, his only blood, lost to sickness before the mountain had claimed him. The weight of this girl against him stirred that old grief, reopening wounds he thought had scarred shut. He had fled from the world to escape such pain, yet here it was again, live in his arms. The cabin came into sight after what felt like hours, though it had been less. Its rough wooden walls leaned against the mountain rock, smoke stains blackened around the chimney, though no fire burned now. He hurried to the door, pushing it open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of pine resin and old ashes. He set her gently on the bed of furs in the corner, then crouched beside her. "You're safe here," he said, though the words felt fragile even as they left his lips. Her wide eyes searched his face. "The voice," she whispered. "He's coming." He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Who is he?" Her lips trembled, but no answer came. She only shook her head, as though speaking his name would give him power. The man did not press her. Instead, he stood, pulling down tools from the shelf, an old hammer, file, a length of iron he had kept from his working days. He laid them out on the table, staring at the chains that bound her as he lifted the hammer. Tss! A sound drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls. Not the howl of wolves, not the rustle of branches, but footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Drawing nearer, the mountain man froze, gripping the hammer tighter. His chest rose and fell heavily, his eyes darting to the door. The girl's hands clutched at the furs, her body curling tighter as though bracing for what she already knew was coming. He moved quickly to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The steps paused. Then came the same voice, low and steady, almost calm. "You've taken what is mine?" The man's blood ran cold. He glanced back at the girl, at the chains that hissed and rattled when touched, at the terror etched into her young face. Whoever this figure was, they had not bound her simply for cruelty. They had bound her as if she were a possession, a prize, or something far worse. The hammer in his hand felt heavy, almost useless against a threat he couldn't yet see. His pulse thundered in his ears. For years he had avoided every fight, every burden, every voice but his own. Now the fight had come to his door, and it had come for her. The steps outside resumed, circling the cabin. Slow, unhurried, as though the figure had all the time in the world. The man's throat tightened. He had lived in these mountains long enough to know predators when he heard them. And this was no hunter of beasts. This was something else entirely. The girl's whisper carried through the room, soft but sharp as broken glass. "Don't let him take me." Her plea cut deeper than the chains, deeper than the silence, deeper than the years of grief he had buried. His hands shook, not from fear alone, but from the storm rising inside him. For so long, he had been nothing but a shadow of a man, broken and hidden. But now, standing between her and the voice in the dark, he felt something stirring, something fierce, something alive. Outside, the footsteps stopped again. Right at the door, the man raised the hammer, his breath steadying, his eyes burning with tears and fire all at once. And then came the knock. 3 slow raps that echoed through the cabin, each one heavier than the last. The silence that followed was unbearable. The mountain man's grip tightened. The girl's chains rattled as she curled against the bed, whispering a prayer to the mother who had told her he would save her. But the voice outside spoke again, calm and certain. "Open the door? She belongs to me." And in that moment, the mountain seemed to lean closer, the night itself holding its breath. Waiting to see what he would do, the knock at the cabin door seemed to echo longer than it should, sinking into the wooden walls, vibrating in the mountain man's bones. He did not move at first. He only stood with the hammer clenched in his hand, his breath slow but heavy. His eyes fixed on the door as if staring hard enough would force the truth to reveal itself. The girl clung to the bed, the chains tight around her wrists and ankles, her wide eyes flicking between him and the door. Waiting for his choice, the voice outside came again, lower this time, almost like a growl. "You've kept her long enough. She was given, and she will be taken." The man's jaw tightened. Given, the word struck him hard. Someone had offered her to whatever was out there. Someone had allowed this to happen. He turned his gaze back to the girl, and though she shook her head violently as if to deny it, he could see in her eyes that there was truth buried in the voice's claim. He moved quietly to the window, peering through a narrow crack in the wooden shutters. The moon cast silver light across the snow-dusted ground, shadows stretching long. At first, he saw nothing but the forest edge, the thick wall of trees that hid everything beyond. But then his eyes caught movement, a shape, tall and still, cloaked in darkness. He could not see the face, only the outline of something that was not entirely man. It stood straight, too straight. As though the body was a shell being held up by something else, the mountain man pulled back, his heart thundering. He had faced storms that tore trees from the earth, beasts that snarled in the night, hunger that threatened to hollow him out. But this was different. This was not nature. It was something unnatural that had chosen the girl as its anchor. The knock came again, this time sharper, impatient. The man's mind raced. If he opened the door, he would expose her to whatever waited outside. If he stayed locked inside, the cabin might hold for a time, but not forever. He had built it to endure storms. It's not the will of a figure like this. The girl's voice cut through his thoughts, trembling but certain. "Don't let him see me. He looks different when he's near. He changes." Her words stumbled, as though she was remembering pieces she wished she could forget. His eyes, they burn. They don't blink. Mama said not to look at them too long. The man stepped closer to her, kneeling down so she could see his face. He tried to keep his voice steady. "Why you? Why would he come for you?" Tears welled in her eyes, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak. But the chains hissed and tightened, pulling her wrists toward the ground. She cried out softly, curling in pain. The mountain man grabbed at the iron links, pulling hard, but the metal only seared colder, resisting as though alive. The locks gleamed faintly under the firelight, and for the first time he noticed markings etched into them, symbols he didn't recognize. Carved deep, glowing faint like embers. His chest tightened. These were no ordinary chains. Whoever had placed them had bound her not just with metal, but with something older, something hidden. Outside, the voice spoke again, closer now, right against the door. "She is marked. You cannot unbind her. Open, and I may let you live." The man rose to his feet, anger cutting through his fear. He had buried too many things in his life, surrendered too much. He had sworn never to care again, because caring always ended in loss. Yet here he was, caring more than he thought possible. And he would not let her be taken without a fight. The footsteps outside began to circle again, slow and heavy. Each step creaked the snow, deliberate, as if tracing a boundary around the cabin. The man followed the sound with his ears, shifting closer to the window. When he peered out again, the figure was gone. The forest was still, but the silence was heavier than before. Then came a sound from deeper in the trees. Not footsteps this time, but whispers. Many whispers, layered together, rising and falling like wind through hollow stone. The girl whimpered, pressing her hands against her ears. But the chains rattled louder, vibrating against the floor. The mountain man's gut twisted. It wasn't just one presence out there. It was more. The fire in the hearth sputtered suddenly, flames snapping higher, then dipping low. He rushed to it, adding wood quickly, but the flames hissed as though fighting against some unseen force. Shadows stretched long across the walls, twisting unnaturally. He backed away, keeping himself between the fire and the girl. Her voice broke through the crackle of the flames. He's not alone. They follow him. Mama said they would. The whispers outside grew louder, threading through the trees, circling the cabin like wolves. The man gripped the hammer tight, his breath sharp. He forced himself to think clearly. Panic would kill them both faster than whatever waited outside. He needed a plan, something beyond brute strength. He glanced at the symbols on the chains again. If they were carved by human hands, they could be broken by human hands too. Maybe not tonight, maybe not quickly, but it was possible. And if the figure outside wanted her so badly, it meant she wasn't fully his yet. There was a gap, a weakness. The man bent low again, speaking softly to her. "Your mother, why did she tell you about me? How could she know I was here?" The girl shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Mama said you were the only one who still remembered. The only one who could stand against him." His throat tightened. Remembered what? He had come to the mountains to forget, not to remember. Yet something about her words stirred faint pieces of memory. Fragments of old stories told by fires long gone, warnings he had dismissed as superstition. The whispers outside swelled, rising like a tide. Then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was thick, unnatural. The man stood, hammer ready, his muscles tense. A voice called out again. But this time, it was not the deep growl from before. It was lighter, higher, carrying a tone almost gentle. "Let me in, please. It's cold out here." The man froze. That voice, he knew it. It was his daughter's voice. The daughter he had buried years ago. His grip on the hammer faltered. For a moment, he could not breathe. His eyes darted to the girl on the bed, but she was shaking her head violently, whispering, "Don't listen. It's not her. It's never who you think it is." The man's chest burned, torn between the ache of memory and the warning in her voice. He pressed his hand against the door, his knuckles white around the hammer. The cabin seemed to lean inward, every shadow pressing close, every breath of air charged with weight. The gentle voice outside spoke again, softer now, closer to the cracks in the wood. "Papa, don't you miss me?" Tears welled in his eyes, blinding him. The grief he had buried clawed its way back up, raw and merciless. For years he had cursed himself for not being able to save her, for not being able to fight harder against the sickness that stole her. And now, here in the cold night, her voice was calling to him as though she had never left. The girl's chains rattled violently, pulling against the bed as if they were alive, straining toward the door. She cried out, her voice desperate. "It's him. He's trying to take you too." The man staggered back, the hammer heavy in his grip, his mind spiraling between the memory of his daughter's laugh and the terror in the girl's eyes. He had never been so divided, so close to breaking. The forest outside pulsed with whispers again. The figure's true voice rose beneath them, darker than before. "You cannot protect her. You cannot even protect yourself." The mountain man's breath caught in his throat, his tears still falling, his grip still tight. He was trapped between past and present, grief and rage, faith and fear. The night outside pressed tighter. The cabin walls groaning, as though straining under a weight they could not bear. And as the fire flickered low, the mountain held its silence. Waiting for the breaking point, the firelight guttered low, the shadows stretching taller and twisting across the cabin walls. Every flicker seemed to bend into shapes that were not its own, figures stretching arms and faces that shouldn't exist. The mountain man held the hammer so tightly his knuckles whitened, the weight of it the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the pull of the voice outside. His daughter's voice, sweet, familiar, impossible, still echoed through him, scraping at wounds that had never healed. The girl on the bed writhed against her chains, the metal clinking louder as though it was feeding off the presence outside. Her small hands shook as she tried to hold herself still, her face pale with fear. "Don't answer him," she begged, her voice cracking. "That's how he takes you. He makes you believe. Don't let him in." The mountain man pressed his forehead against the door, eyes burning. The voice outside shifted again, softening, curling into a whisper that slithered through the cracks. You left me. You let me die. But I can come back. Open the door, and it will be like it was before. His chest heaved, the weight of guilt crushing him. He had run from the world to escape those words, to bury the memory of the night he lost his child. Now, it stood outside his door, dressed in the voice he longed to hear most. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he nearly gave in. Then the girl screamed. Her chains jerked her body hard against the bed frame, the symbols glowing brighter, searing her skin. The sound snapped him back, cutting through his grief. He spun toward her, rushing to her side. She clawed at the iron as if it were burning her alive. He grabbed her wrists gently, trying to steady her. Stay with me, he said, his voice shaking but firm. I won't let him take you. Her tear-filled eyes met his. He's angry. He knows you won't open the door. The cabin shuddered suddenly, the wooden beams groaning as though struck by a force outside. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The man jumped to his feet, planting himself between the girl and the door. Another shudder came, heavier, rattling the walls. Making the shutters clap against the windows, the whispers outside turned into a chorus. Hundreds of voices layered on top of each other, rising in pitch until they scraped at the ears. The girl screamed again, curling into herself. The fire in the hearth blew out all at once, leaving the cabin plunged into near darkness. Only the faint glow of the chains remained, pulsing like veins of molten iron. The man's breathing grew ragged. He swung the hammer toward the table, striking sparks from the iron bar, trying to relight the fire. The sparks flared briefly, but the darkness pressed in too thick. Swallowing the light before it could catch, the knock returned louder, heavier, shaking the door on its hinges. Then another and another, until the wood groaned under the weight. The voice outside roared now. No longer pretending, no longer coaxing. She is mine. You are nothing. You cannot keep her from me. The mountain man shouted back, his voice raw, his body shaking with fury and fear. She is not yours. The reply came as a crash against the cabin wall, so violent the wooden planks splintered. The man stumbled, but stayed standing, hammer raised high. He felt every ounce of his solitude, every year of silence pressing against him now, but he would not yield. The girl's chains rattled harder, pulling her across the floor as though something invisible tugged at her. She screamed, reaching for him, her small fingers clawing at the air. He dropped to his knees, grabbing hold of her, pulling her back with all his strength. The chains fought him, stretching like they were alive, their symbols glowing brighter, hissing as though in rage. The ground beneath the cabin trembled, earth itself responding to the presence outside. Cracks split across the floorboards, and a cold wind seeped up through them, carrying with it the stench of ash and rot. The man gagged, his eyes watering, but he tightened his grip on the girl. Her voice came in gasps, each word a struggle. Mama said, if you held on, he couldn't take me. Don't let go. Tears streaked down his face, mixing with sweat and soot. His muscles burned, his arms straining as the chains dragged harder. But he clung to her, his hammer forgotten on the floor beside him. I won't let go, he cried, voice breaking. Not this time. The cabin shook again, harder, the doorframe cracking. Through the splintered wood, a hand forced its way inside. It was long, too long, the skin pale and stretched, the fingers tipped with black nails. They clawed at the air, reaching for the girl. The mountain man roared, surging forward. He swung the hammer with every ounce of strength he had left, slamming it down on the invading hand. A shriek ripped through the night, so piercing it rattled the very walls. The hand recoiled, pulling back into the dark. But the force outside grew more furious. The whispers returned in a flood, pouring through every crack in the cabin. Words twisted into his ears, promises, curses, threats. He tried to block them out, but they slithered into his mind, dragging him back to his worst memories, his deepest regrets. His daughter's face, pale and still, his own voice screaming her name into the night. His legs giving out as he realized she was gone forever. The girl's voice cut through the storm, high and desperate. "Don't listen. Listen to me, please." He snapped his gaze back to her. She was crying, her arms stretched toward him, the chains still glowing as they pulled against her body. In that moment, he saw not just her fear, but her trust. She believed in him, as her mother had told her to. She believed he could do what no one else had. His chest heaved, the weight of the moment pressing down harder than any storm he had faced. He tightened his grip on her, his eyes blazing. Outside, the voice bellowed, furious and endless. "You will fail. You always fail." The door shuddered once more, the wood splitting wide, the darkness pushing inside like a flood. The man screamed with the effort, holding her tighter as the chains tore at the floor, as the voices roared in his ears, as the cabin itself seemed to collapse around them, and then the shadows surged forward, crashing through the broken doorway, swallowing the light, filling the room with a darkness so thick it drowned the air itself. The mountain man pulled the girl against his chest. His arms wrapped around her as the storm of whispers and claws closed in. His tears fell hot and heavy, but his grip did not falter. The cabin groaned, the mountain trembled, and the night itself seemed to reach the point of breaking. And just as the darkness engulfed them both, the girl's chains flared with a blinding light. The light from the chains burst outward and filled the room like a sunrise breaking through a storm. It wasn't hot, and it wasn't blinding for long. It was steady and warm, a simple light that felt like a hand held out to someone on the edge. The shadows recoiled from it, pulling back from the walls and slipping through the cracked door like smoke pulled by a wind. The chorus of whispers thinned, then cracked apart. All that remained was the sound of two hearts beating his, and the girl's close together in the quiet cabin. He kept his arms around her until the light softened and settled, until the chains cooled to a dull gray and lay still across the furs. He loosened his grip, afraid to believe it, and then realized the iron no longer hissed when he touched it. He pressed one of the locks with the tip of his finger. It was cold as any ordinary metal. The carved markings had faded, no longer glowing, no longer holding life. He reached for the old hammer and with one clean strike, shattered the first lock. It broke like glass. The second followed. The third fell apart in his hands. The girl's breath hitched when the last chain fell away. She sat there for a long second, stunned, as if her body didn't remember what freedom felt like. Then she threw her arms around him and sobbed into his shoulder. He closed his eyes and exhaled, a slow, shaking breath he had been holding for years. In the corner, almost shy, a small flame lifted itself in the hearth and took hold of the wood. Warmth moved into the room again. Outside, the night was still. No voice called. No footstep cracked the snow. The mountain stood the way it always had, quiet, steady, watchful. He helped the girl to her feet. Her wrists were raw, where the chains had bitten, but the skin had cooled. He wrapped them in soft cloth torn from a blanket and whispered that it would be all right now. She nodded, tears still shining in her eyes, and looked down at the broken metal scattered across the floor. "What happened?" she asked, as if testing her own memory. "What was that light?" He swallowed, feeling his throat ache. "I think it was the end of a promise that should never have been made," he said. "In the beginning of one we chose for ourselves?" The words surprised him even as he said them. He didn't know where they came from, only that they were true. He had held on when everything tried to pull them apart. The light had come when he refused to let go. The girl's mother had told her the right thing. If he held on, the darkness couldn't take her. Love had been the lockpick. Love. And a stubborn will that would not open the door to lies. They stayed awake until the thin gray line of dawn reached the window. When the first birds began to stir in the pines, he rose and stepped outside. The air was sharp and clean, and the sky over the peaks was washed with pale colors. He walked the shallow arc around the cabin where the presents had paced. In the snow, he found a ring of prints that were not truly footprints. They were too long to even, and where the door had cracked. There was no sign of blood or flesh, only ash pressed into the wood. Ash cold and fine as dust. He gathered the pieces of chain and the shattered locks and carried them into the morning. The girl followed, wrapped in his coat, quiet and watchful. Together they climbed the short slope behind the cabin to a shelf of stone that looked east. He laid the iron on the rock and waited. When the sun lifted its rim over the ridge, the pieces of chain gave a faint sound, almost like a sigh, and crumbled into powder. The wind took them grain by grain. By the time the light fell full, there was nothing left to bury. When he turned, the girl was staring at the valley as if seeing it for the first time. "Is it over?" she asked. "It is for us," he said. He wasn't sure if that meant forever, but he meant it for now. He needed the word now to be enough. Back in the cabin, they ate slowly bread, dried berries, a little honey, and the girl found her voice in pieces. She spoke of a quiet village beyond the southern pines, where she had lived with her mother in a small house by a stream. Strangers had come through for weeks, telling stories about the mountain, about old bargains and old protections, about fear that could be traded if you paid the right price. People listened because winter can make even strong hearts tremble. She said there was a leader among them, a man with a smile that never reached his eyes, who said the cold would pass for those who gave over their fear. Her mother didn't listen at first. But the nights grew long, and the house held too many shadows. One evening, voices had filled the yard. The man had stood in the doorway and said her mother's name. He had spoken softly about safety, about relief. "You will not lose anything that matters," he had promised. "Only what hurts you." The girl's mother had stepped in front of her, arms spread, saying no. The wind had lifted, the lamp had gone out, and when it came back, the girl was alone in the yard. A whisper had led her into the trees. When she looked back, the house was dark. The mountain man listened without interruption. When she paused to steady her breath, he asked the question he had carried since the first night. "How did your mother know me? Why did she tell you I would save you?" The girl reached into the pocket of the coat and drew out a small, flat token. It was smooth from years of handling. On one side was a scratched drawing of the mountain ridge and a single tall pine. On the other, a word he hadn't seen in a long time, one that had been carved into a wooden toy he once made by hand. It was the name of his daughter. She said you were the only person who remembered that the mountain had a heart, the girl whispered. She said once you held someone all night so they wouldn't be afraid of the dark. He took the token and felt the ridges under his thumb. He had made this years ago for the child he lost, and given it to a traveler who had passed through after the funeral when he could not bear to keep any reminder. The traveler had said she would carry it and pass it on to someone who needed it more. Somehow, it had found its way to a mother who knew what kind of person to trust. He closed his eyes and breathed. The ache in his chest was still there, but it had changed. It felt less like a wound and more like a scar you touch to remember where you've been. "We should go to your village," he said at last. "If your mother is there, we'll find her. If she's not, we'll ask the right questions." They left when the sun was high. The path wound between dark trees and bright patches of snow, the air tasting new. He carried a pack and a walking staff. The girl walked at his side with careful steps. Along the way, they saw small signs of the night-broken branches whose shadows bent the wrong way. Patches of frost that didn't melt in the light. But as they moved downhill, those signs thinned. And the forest returned to the ordinary music of winter birds and distant water. By late afternoon, they reached the ridge that overlooked the valley. The village lay small and still, smoke rising in faint threads. As they entered, a few faces turned with fear ready on them, then softened into surprise. The mountain man had not walked among them in years. Some remembered him as a roomer. Some remembered him as a man who once fixed doors and mended tools and carried wood to old porches without asking for thanks. He asked for the house by the stream. An older woman pointed without a word. They found the door open and the room empty, but not abandoned. A kettle sat by the hearth. A shawl lay on a chair. On the table, a line of willow leaves had been laid the way some people mark a path for those who follow. The girl's hand trembled in his. They walked to the back where the stream ran cold and clear, and there sitting on the bank, her hands in her lap. Her eyes tired but alive was the girl's mother. There was no speech for a while. Only the sound of feet running over frost-hardened grass and the soft, complete sound of a child falling into a parent's arms. The mother looked up at him when she could, gratitude and grief mixed together in her eyes. He nodded once. It was enough. At dusk, people gathered to listen. He told them only what they needed, that fear had been traded, and that bargains like that always ask for more. He spoke of voices that wear familiar faces and of chains that are symbols first and metal second. He said the mountain does not ask for payment, only for patience, and that the strongest protection they had was the will to hold each other when the night pressed in. They listened because the truth was simple, and because the girl stood there free. In the days that followed, he stayed. He helped repair doors, mended fence rails, and walked with whoever needed to gather wood near the tree line. He taught them to look for the wrong kind of shadow and to speak aloud when whispers tried to drive them inward. He showed them how to mark a window with willow and salt, not as magic, but as a promise to themselves that they would not open to fear. The village grew quieter in a good way. The winter passed like winters do, hard at times, beautiful at others, and no stranger came to take anything that mattered. When the snow began to loosen on the high slopes, he climbed back to his cabin. He cleaned the broken frame, planed new boards, and set the door strong on its hinges. On the inside, he carved a small line of words, not as a charm, but as a reminder. Hold on. Do not open to lies. He kept the token with the ridge and the tall pine. And sometimes, when the valley was quiet and the sky was clear, he would stand outside and hold it up to the light. He thought of his daughter, not with the stabbing pain of what was lost, but with a steady warmth for the love that had been real. He did not hear her voice in the wind anymore, because he no longer needed it to tell him who he was. One morning in spring, the girl and her mother climbed the path to visit. They brought fresh bread and a small carved bird for the windowsill. They sat by the door and watched the clouds move, and they talked about ordinary things, the bend of the stream, the first flowers, the way the mountain casts its long shadow at evening. There was peace in it, the kind you don't ask too many questions about because you don't want to scare it away. The story of the girl in chains. The mountain man and the night of voices became the tale folks told when winter set in again. They called it a rescue story, a survival story. A story about the wilderness and the strength people find when they refuse to open the door to fear. The words changed a little each time, but the heart of it stayed the same. If you hold on, if you stand with someone in the dark has less to take. He remained what he had always been, part of the mountain, part of the village, a man who had learned that silence can heal, but only when it is shared. And when the wind moved through the tall pine at the ridge and the light touched the old cabin just right, it felt like a soft blessing over everything that had been broken and made whole again in the end. There was no grand lesson written across the sky, only a simple one written in how people lived. Love does not bargain. Courage does not shout. Hope walks beside you, steady and plain, and it is enough. And when the mountain held its quiet, that quiet felt like home.